Part 5, Chapter 1 of Home Education Series, Volume 1, Home Education. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Home Education Series, Volume 1, Home Education by Charlotte Mason. Part 5, Chapter 1, The Matter and Method of Lessons. Read by Boat Harbor, Houston, Texas. It seems to me that we live in an age of pedagogy, that we of the teaching profession are inclined to take too much upon ourselves, and that parents are ready to yield the responsibility of direction, as well as of actual instruction, more than is wholesome for the children. Parents must reflect on the subject matter of instruction. I am about to invite your attention to a subject that parents are accustomed to leave very much in the hands of schoolmaster or governess when they do not instruct their children themselves. I mean the choice of subjects of instruction, and the ways of handling those subjects. Teachers are the people who have, more than others, given themselves to the consideration of what a child should learn and how he should learn it. But the parent also should have thought out the subject, and even when he does not profess to teach his children, should have his own carefully formed opinions as to the subject matter and the method of their intellectual education. And this for the sake of the teacher as well as for that of the children. Nothing does more to give vitality and purpose to the work of the teacher than the certainty that the parents of his pupils go with him. Even when children go to schools taught by qualified persons, some insight on the part of fathers and mothers is useful as hindering the teacher from dropping into professional grooves, valuing proficiency in this or that subject for its own sake, and not as it affects the children. But in the early days of the home schoolroom, it is iniquitous to leave the young governess with little qualification beyond her native French or German, or scanty English, to chalk out a course for herself and her charges. That the children waste their time is the least of the evils that accrue. They are forming habits dead against intellectual effort, and by, when they go to school, the lessons go over their heads, the work slips through their fingers, and their powers of passive resistance baffle the most strenuous teachers. Home the best growing ground for young children. All the same, whatever be the advantages of kindergarten or other schools for little children, the home schoolroom ought to be the best growing ground for them. And doubtless it would be so, were the mother at liberty to devote herself to the instruction of her children. But this she is seldom free to do. If she live in a town, she can send them to school when they are 6. If in the country, she must have a governess. And the difficulty is to get a woman who is not only acquainted with the subjects she undertakes to teach, but who understands in some measure the nature of the child and the art and objects of education. A woman capable of making the very most of the children without waste of power or of time. Such a rara avis does not present herself in answer to every advertisement, and in default of a trained teacher, the mother must undertake to train her governess. That is, she may supplement with her own insight the scanty knowledge and experience of the young teacher. I wish the children to be taught to read, thus and thus, because, or to learn history in such a way that the lessons may have such and such effects. Half an hour's talk of this kind with a sensible governess will secure a whole month's work for the children, so well directed that much is done in little time, and the widest possible margin secured for play and open-air exercise. 3 questions for the mother. But if the mother is to inoculate the governess with her views as to the teaching of writing, French, geography, she must herself have definite views. She must ask herself seriously, why must the children learn at all? What should they learn? And how should they learn it? If she take the trouble to find a definite and thoughtful answer to each of these 3 queries, she will be in a position to direct her children's studies, and will, at the same time, be surprised to find that 3/4 of the time and labor ordinarily spent by the children at his lessons is lost time and wasted energy. Children learn to grow. Why must the child learn? Why do we eat? Is it not in order that the body may live and grow and be able to fulfill its functions? Precisely so must the mind be sustained and developed by means of the food convenient for it, the mental pabulum of assimilated knowledge. Again, the body is developed not only by means of proper sustenance, but by the appropriate exercise of each of its members. A young mother remarked to me the other day that before her marriage she had such slender arms she never liked to exhibit them, but a strong 5-month-old baby had cured her of that. She could toss and lift him with ease, and could now show well-rounded arms with anybody. And just as the limbs grow strong with exercise, so does intellectual effort with a given power of the mind make that power effective. People are apt to overlook the fact that mind must have its aliment. We learn that we may know, not that we may grow. Hence, the parrot-like saying of lessons, the cramming of ill-digested facts for examinations, all the ways of taking in knowledge which the mind does not assimilate. Doctoring of the material of knowledge. Specialists, on the other hand, are apt to attach too much importance to the several exercise of the mental faculties. We come across books on teaching with lessons elaborately drawn up, in which certain work is assigned to the perceptive faculties, certain work to the imagination, to the judgment, and so on. Now this doctrine of the faculties, which rests on a false analogy between the mind and the body, is on its way to the limbo where the phrenologist's bumps now rest in peace. The mind would appear to be one and indivisible, and endowed with manifold powers, and this sort of doctoring of the material of knowledge is unnecessary for the healthy child, whose mind is capable of self-direction, and of applying itself to its proper work upon the parcel of knowledge delivered to it. Almost any subject which common sense points out as suitable for the instruction of children will afford exercise for all their powers if properly presented. Children learn to get ideas. The child must learn in the second place in order that ideas may be freely sown in the fruitful soil of his mind. Idea, the image or picture formed by the mind of anything external, whether sensible or spiritual. So the dictionary. Therefore, if the business of teaching be to furnish the child with ideas, any teaching which does not leave him possessed of a new mental image has, by so far, missed its mark. Now, just think of the listless way in which the children too often drag through reading and tables, geography and sums, and you will see that it is a rare thing for any part of any lesson to flash upon them with the vividness which leaves a mental picture behind. It is not too much to say that a morning in which a child receives no new idea is a morning wasted, however closely the little student has been kept at his books. Ideas grow and produce after their kind. For the dictionary appears to me to fall short of the truth in its definition of the term idea. An idea is more than an image or a picture. It is, so to speak, a spiritual germ endowed with vital force, with power, that is, to grow and to produce after its kind. It is the very nature of an idea to grow. As the vegetable germ secretes that it lives by, so fairly implant an idea in the child's mind, and it will secrete its own food, grow and bear fruit in the form of a succession of kindred ideas. We know from our own experience that, let our attention be forcibly drawn to some public character, some startling theory, and for days after we are continually hearing or reading matter which bears on this one subject, just as if all the world were thinking about what occupies our thoughts. The fact being that the new idea we have received is in the act of growth, and is reaching out after its appropriate food. This process of feeding goes on with peculiar avidity in childhood, and the growth of an idea in the child is proportionally rapid. Scott and Stevenson worked with ideas. Scott got an idea, a whole group of ideas, out of the border tales and ballads, the folklore of the countryside on which his boyhood was nourished. His ideas grew and brought forth, and the Waverley novels are the fruit they bore. George Stephenson made little clay engines with his playmate, Thomas Dalloway. By and by, when he was an engine man, he was always watching his engine, cleaning it, studying it. An engine was his dominant idea, and it developed into no less a thing than the locomotive. Value of dominant ideas. But how does this theory of the vital and fruitful character of ideas bear upon the education of the child? In this way: give your child a single valuable idea, and you have done more for his education than if you had laid upon his mind the burden of bushels of information. For the child who grows up with a few dominant ideas has his self-education provided for, his career marked out. Lessons must furnish ideas. In order for the reception of an idea, the mind must be in an attitude of eager attention, and how to secure that state we have considered elsewhere. One thing more. A single idea may be a possession so precious in itself, so fruitful, that the parent cannot fitly allow the child's selection of ideas to be matter of chance. His lessons should furnish him with such ideas as shall make for his further education. Children learn to get knowledge, but it is not only to secure due intellectual growth and the furnishing of his mind with ideas that the child must learn. The common notion that he learns for the sake of getting knowledge is also a true one, so much so that no knowledge should be so precious as that gained in childhood. No later knowledge should be so clearly chronicled on the brain, nor so useful as the foundation of that to follow. At the same time, the child's capacity for knowledge is very limited. His mind is, in this respect at least, but a little phial with a narrow neck, and therefore it behooves parent or teacher to pour in only of the best. Diluted knowledge. But, poor children, they are too often badly used by their best friends in the matter of the sort of knowledge offered them. Grown-up people who are not mothers talk and think far more childishly than the child does in their efforts to approach his mind. If a child talk twaddle, it is because his elders are in the habit of talking twaddle to him. Leave him to himself, and his remarks are wise and sensible, so far as his small experience guides him. Mothers seldom talk down to their children. They are too intimate with the little people, and have, therefore, too much respect for them. But professional teachers, whether the writers of books or the givers of lessons, are too apt to present a single grain of pure knowledge in a whole gallon of talk, imposing upon the child the labor of discerning the grain and of extracting it from the worthless flood. Dr. Arnold's knowledge as a child. On the whole, the children who grow up amongst their elders, and are not provided with what are called children's books at all, fare the better on what they are able to glean for themselves from the literature of grown-up people. Thus it is told of Dr. Arnold, that when he was 3 years old he received a present from his father of Smollett's History of England, as a reward for the accuracy with which he went through the stories connected with the portraits and pictures of the successive reigns, an amusement which probably laid the foundation of the great love for history which distinguished him in after life. When occupying the professorial chair at Oxford, he made quotations, we are told, from Dr. Priestley's Lectures on History, verbally accurate quotations, we may believe, for such was the habit of his mind. Besides, a child has little skill in recasting his matter, and that, though he had not had the book in his hands since he was a child of 8. No doubt he was an exceptional child, and all I maintain is, that had his reading been the sort of diluted twaddle which is commonly thrust upon children, it would have been impossible for him to cite passages a week, much less some 20 years after the reading. Literature proper for children. This sort of weak literature for the children, both in story and lesson books, is the result of a reactionary process. Not so long ago, the current impression was that the children had little understanding, but prodigious memory for facts, dates, numbers, rules, catechisms of knowledge. Much information in small parcels was supposed to be the fitting material for a child's education. We have changed all that, and put into the children's hands lesson books with pretty pictures and easy talk, almost as good as storybooks. But we do not see that, after all, we are but giving the same little pills of knowledge in the form of a weak and copious diluent. Teachers and even parents who are careful enough about their children's diets are so reckless as to the sort of mental aliment offered to them that I am exceedingly anxious to secure consideration for this question of the lessons in literature proper for the little people. 4 tests which should be applied to children's lessons. We see, then, that the children's lessons should provide material for their mental growth, should exercise the several powers of their minds, should furnish them with fruitful ideas, and should afford them knowledge, really valuable for its own sake, accurate and interesting, of the kind that the child may recall as a man, with profit and pleasure. Before applying these tests to the various subjects in which children are commonly instructed, may I remind you of 2 or 3 points which I have endeavored to establish in the preceding pages. Resume of 6 points already considered. A. That the knowledge most valuable to the child is that which he gets with his own eyes and ears and fingers under direction in the open air. B. That the claims of the schoolroom should not be allowed to encroach on the child's right to long hours daily for exercise and investigation. C. That the child should be taken daily, if possible, to scenes, moor or meadow, park, common, or shore, where he may find new things to examine, and so add to his store of real knowledge. That the child's observation should be directed to flower or boulder, bird or tree, and that, in fact, he should be employed in gathering the common information, which is the basis of scientific knowledge. D. That play, vigorous, healthful play, is in turn fully as important as lessons, as regards both bodily health and brain power. E. That the child, though under supervision, should be left much to himself, both that he may go to work in his own way on the ideas he receives, and also that he may be more open to natural influences. F. That the happiness of the child is the condition of his progress, that his lessons should be joyous, and that occasion of friction in the schoolroom are greatly to be deprecated. Premising so much, let us now consider what the children should learn and how they should be taught. End of Part 5, Chapter 1.
Part 5, Chapter 2 of Home Education, Series Volume 1, Home Education. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Home Education Series Volume 1, Home Education by Charlotte Mason. Part 5, Chapter 2, The Kindergarten as a Place of Education. The Mother the Best Kindergartnerin. It is hardly necessary here to discuss the merits of the kindergarten school. The success of such a school demands rare qualities in the teacher: high culture, some knowledge of psychology and of the art of education, intense sympathy with the children, much tact, much common sense, much common information, much joyousness of nature, and much governing power. In a word, the kindergarten method is nicely contrived to bring the child in rapport with a superior intelligence. Given such a superior being to conduct it, and the kindergarten is beautiful. 'Tis like a little heaven below. But put a commonplace woman in charge of such a school, and the charmingly devised gifts and games and occupations become so many instruments of wooden teaching. If the very essence of the kindergarten method is personal influence, a sort of spiritual mesmerism, it follows that the mother is naturally the best kindergartnerin, for who so likely is she to have the needful tact, sympathy, common sense, culture? The nursery need not therefore be a kindergarten. Though every mother should be a kindergartnerin, in the sense in which Froebel would employ the term, it does not follow that every nursery should be a regularly organized kindergarten. Indeed, the machinery of the kindergarten is no more than a device to ensure the carrying out of certain educational principles, and some of these it is the mother's business to get at and work out according to Froebel's method or her own. For instance, in the kindergarten, the child's senses are carefully and progressively trained. He looks, listens, learns by touch, gets ideas of size, color, form, number, is taught to copy faithfully, express exactly. And in this training of the senses, the child is made to pursue the method the infant shapes for himself in his early studies of ring or ball. Field of knowledge too circumscribed. But it is possible that the child's marvellous power of obtaining knowledge by means of his senses may be undervalued, that the field may be too circumscribed, and that during the first 6 or 7 years in which he might have become intimately acquainted with the properties and history of every natural object within his reach, he has obtained exact ideas, it is true, can distinguish a rhomboid from a pentagon, a primary from a secondary colour, has learned to see so truly that he can copy what he sees in folded paper or woven straw, but this at the expense of much of that real knowledge of the external world, which at no time of his life will he be so fitted to acquire. Therefore, while the exact, nicely graduated training of the kindergarten may be of value, the mother will endeavour to give it by the way, and will by no means let it stand for that wider training of the senses, to secure which, for her children, is a primary duty. Again, the child in the kindergarten is set to such tasks only as he is competent to perform, and then whatever he has to do he is expected to do perfectly. I have seen a 4-year-old child blush and look as self condemned because he had folded a slip of paper irregularly, as if found out in a falsehood. But mother or nurse is quite able to secure that the child's small offices are perfectly executed, and here is an important point, without that slight strain of distressful anxiety which may be observed in children labouring to please that smiling goddess, their kindergartnerin. Training of a just eye and faithful hand. The kindergarten occupations afford opportunities for training in this kind of faithfulness, but in the home 1,000 such opportunities occur, if only in such trifles as the straightening of a tablecloth or of a picture, the hanging of a towel, the packing of a parcel. Every thoughtful mother invents 1,000 ways of training in her child a just eye and a faithful hand. Nevertheless, as a means of methodical training as well as of happy employment, the introduction of some of the games and occupations of the kindergarten into the nursery may be allowed, provided that the mother does not depend upon these, but makes all the child's occupations subserve the purposes of his education. Sweetness and light in the kindergarten. The child breathes an atmosphere of sweetness and light in the kindergarten. You see the sturdy urchin of 5 stiffen his back, and decline to be a jumping frog, and the kindergartnerin comes with unruffled gentleness, takes him by the hand, and leads him out of the circle. He is not treated as an offender, only he does not choose to do as others do, therefore he is not wanted there. The next time he is quite content to be a frog. Here we have the principle for the discipline of the nursery. Do not treat the child's small contumacy too seriously. Do not assume that he is being naughty. Just leave him out when he is not prepared to act in harmony with the rest. Avoid friction, and above all, do not let him disturb the moral atmosphere. In all gentleness and serenity remove him from the company of the others when he is being what nurses call tiresome. Once more, the kindergarten professes to take account of the joyousness of the child's nature, to allow him full and free expression for the glee that is in him without the rampaging which follows if he is left to himself to find an outlet for his exuberant life. This union of joy and gentleness is the very temper to be cultivated in the nursery. The boisterous behaviour sometimes allowed in children is unnecessary, within doors at any rate. But even a momentary absence of sunshine on the faces of her children will be a graver cause of uneasiness to the mother. On the whole, we may say that some of the principles which should govern kindergarten training are precisely those in which every thoughtful mother endeavours to bring up her family, while the practices of the kindergarten, being only ways amongst others of carrying out these principles, and being apt to become stereotyped and wooden, are unnecessary, but may be adopted so far as they fit in conveniently with the mother's general scheme for the education of her family. End of Part 5, Chapter 2. Part 5, Chapter 3 of Home Education Series, Volume 1, Home Education. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Home Education Series, Volume 1, Home Education by Charlotte Mason. Part 5, Chapter 3, Further Consideration of the Kindergarten. The Childhood of Tolstoy. There is possibly no known field of research in which so little available work has been done as in that covered by the word children. The fair land lies under our very eyes, but whoso would map it must write unexplored across vast tracts. Thoughtful persons begin to suspect that the mistakes we make through this ignorance are grievous and injurious. For example, are not all our schemes of education founded on the presumption that a child's mind, his thinking, feeling man, begins very small, and grows great with the growth of his body? We cannot tell if this is indeed the case. The children keep themselves to themselves in a general way, their winning ways and frank confidences notwithstanding. But if one of us do, by chance, get a child revealed to him, he is startled to find that the child has by far the keener intelligence, the wiser thoughts, the larger soul of the two. When genius is able to lift the veil and show us a child, it does a service which, in our present state of thought, we are hardly able to appraise. And when genius or simplicity, or both, shall have given us enough such studies to generalize upon, we shall doubtless reconsider the whole subject, and shall be dismayed at the slights we have been putting upon children in the name of education. Count Tolstoy gives us in Childhood, Boyhood, Youth, unmistakable child portraiture, a miniature in which a mother may see her child and recognize what and how much there is in him. Like our own dear mother, the little fellow writes, in the verses he makes for his grandmother's birthday, and then when the verses come to be read, the humiliation of soul he goes through, and how surely he expects father and grandmother to find him out for a hypocrite. Why did I write it? She is not here, and it was not necessary to mention her. I love grandma, it's true. I reverence her, but still she is not the same. Why did I write it? Why have I lied? This is the sort of thing there is in children. We recognize it as we read, and remember the dim, childish days when we too had an organ of truth just so exquisitely delicate, and the recollection should quicken our reverence for the tender consciences of children. The Story of a Child. I should like, while speaking of this subject, to mention another book which contains the self-revelation of a child that once was summoned to give evidence out of the dark abysm of time. This is the sort of study of a child that is really precious, because it is to be had on no other terms than by harking back to our own childhood, vivifying it, reproducing it by mere force of imaginative power. This is absolutely the only way to get into sympathy with a child, for children, with all their frank confidences and ready chatter, are quite inscrutable little persons, who never tell anyone the sort of things that we read in this story. There is no need to tell each other, for other children know, and as for telling the grown ups, children are fully persuaded that no grown up, not even mother, could understand. Ponto might perhaps, and confidences will be poured into the ear of a dog which the loving mother lays herself out for in vain. Each in his hidden sphere of joy or woe our hermit spirits dwell, and range apart. Our eyes see all around in gloom or glow hues of their own, fresh borrowed from the heart. And this is even more notably the case with children than with ourselves. It is a law of our nature with which it is absolutely useless to contend, and our only means of true intimacy with a child is the power of recovering our own childhood, a power which we are apt to let slip as of no vital importance. This Miss Margaret Deland helps us to do. We recognise our old selves with a difference in Ellen, just so irrational, inconsequent, loving, and heroic, and generally tiresome to the grown up world, were our own impulses in that long ago on which we look back with tenderness, but seldom with complacency. If we rise after reading the story of a child, a little more humble, a little more diffident, ready to believe more than we see, why, it will do us no harm, and should bless and help the children. From one word of the author's we should like to differ. Miss Deland thinks that it may be wholesome for the elders to understand children better, but for the children, why, she thinks that most of us grow up wonderfully well in spite of this and all other difficulties. In a sense this is true, but in another sense, one of the saddest things in life is the issue of splendid child material into commonplace, uninteresting maturity, of a kind that the world seems to be neither the better nor the worse for. Tolstoy's childhood and that of Miss Deland's little heroine would appear to be a far cry from the kindergarten. But as a matter of fact, these two revelations of what children are bring our contention to a point. We are told that, but yesterday in the University of Edinburgh the greatest figure in the faculty was Sir James Simpson, the discoverer of chloroform. The other day his successor and nephew, Professor Simpson, was asked by the librarian of the University to go to the library and pick out the books on his subject that were no longer needed, and his reply to the librarian was this: "Take every textbook that is more than 10 years old and put it down in the cellar." So far as education is a science, the truth of even 10, much more 100, years ago is not the whole truth of to day. Thoughts beyond their thought to those high seers were given. And in proportion as the urgency of educational effort presses upon us, will be the ardour of our appreciation, the diligence of our employment, of those truths which the great pioneers, Froebel and the rest, have won for us by no less than prophetic insight. But alas and alas for the cravings of lazy human nature! We may not have an educational pope. We must think out for ourselves as well as work out those things that belong to the perfect bringing up of our children. What we owe to Froebel. We reverence Froebel; many of his great thoughts we share. We cannot say borrow, because some, like the child's relations to the universe, are at least as old as Plato. Others belong to universal practice and experience, and this shows their psychological rightness. Froebel gathered, diffused thought and practice into a system, but he did a greater thing than this. He raised an altar to the enthusiasm of childhood, upon which the flame has never since gone out. The true kindergartnerin is the artist amongst teachers. She is filled with the inspiration of her work, and probably most sincere teachers have caught something from her fervour, some sense of the beauty of childhood, and of the enthralling delight of truly educational work. Requirements of a person. And yet I enter a caveat. Our first care should be to preserve the individuality, give play to the personality, of children. Now, persons do not grow in a garden, much less in a greenhouse. It is a doubtful boon to a person to have conditions too carefully adapted to his needs. The exactly due sunshine and shade, pruning and training, are good for a plant whose uses are subordinate, so to say, to the needs and pleasures of its owner. But a person has other uses in the world, and mother or teacher who regards him as a plant and herself as the gardener will only be saved from grave mistakes by the force of human nature in herself and in her child. Nature as an educator. The notion of supplementing nature from the cradle is a dangerous one. A little guiding, a little restraining, much reverent watching, nature asks of us. But beyond that, it is the wisdom of parents to leave children as much as may be to nature, and to a higher power than nature itself. Danger of undervaluing children's intelligence. Those of us who have watched an urchin of 7 making Catherine wheels down the length of a street, or a group of little girls dancing to a barrel organ, or small boys and girls on a doorstep giving what Dickens calls dry nourishment to their babies, or a small girl sent by her mother to make 4 careful purchases out of 6pence and bring home the change, are not ready to believe that physical, mental, and moral development waits, so to speak, upon kindergarten teaching. Indeed, I am inclined to question whether, in the interest of carrying out a system, the charming kindergartnerin is not in danger, sometimes, of greatly undervaluing the intelligence of her children. I know a person of 3 who happened to be found by a caller alone in the drawing room. It was spring, and the caller thought to make himself entertaining with talk about the pretty ba lambs. But a pair of big blue eyes were fixed upon him, and a solemn person made this solemn remark: "Isn't it a dwefful horrid thing to see a pig killed?" We hope she has never seen or even heard of the killing of a pig, but she has made as effective a protest against twaddle as would any woman of society. Boers and Koppies, Russians and Japs, Treasure Island, Robinson Crusoe, and his man Friday, the fight of Thermopylae, Ulysses and the suitors. These are the sorts of things that children play at by the month together. Even the toddlers of 3 and 4 will hold their own manfully with their brothers and sisters. And if the little people were in the habit of telling how they feel, we should learn perhaps that they are a good deal bored by the nice little games in which they frisk like lambs, flap their fins, and twiddle their fingers like butterflies. We all like to be humoured. But, says the reader, children do all these things so pleasantly and happily in the kindergarten. It is a curious thing about human nature that we all like to be managed by persons who take the pains to play on our amiabilities. Even a dog can be made foolishly sentimental, and if we who are older have our foibles in this kind, it is little wonder that children can be wooed to do anything by persons whose approaches to them are always charming. It is true that W.V., the child whom the world has been taught to love, sang her kindergarten songs with little hands waving in the air so blue. But that was for the delectation and the delusion of the elders when bedtime came. W.V. had greater thoughts at other times. Teachers mediate too much. There are still, probably, kindergartens where a great deal of twaddle is talked in song and story, where the teacher conceives that to make poems for the children herself, and to compose tunes for their singing, and to draw pictures for their admiration, is to fulfil her function to the uttermost. The children might echo Wordsworth's complaint of the world, and say the teacher is too much with us late and soon. Everything is directed, expected, suggested. No other personality out of book, picture, or song, no, not even that of nature herself, can get at the children without the mediation of the teacher. No room is left for spontaneity or personal initiation on their part. Danger of personal magnetism. Most of us are misled by our virtues, and the entire zeal and enthusiasm of the kindergartnerin is perhaps her stone of stumbling. But the children are so happy and good. Precisely. The home nursery is by no means such a scene of peace, but I venture to think it a better growing place. I am delighted to see that an eminent Froebelian protests against the element of personal magnetism in the teacher. But there is or has been a good deal of this element in the successful kindergartner, and we all know how we lose vigour and individuality under this sort of influence. Even apart from this element of charm, I doubt if the self adjusting property of life in the kindergarten is good for children. Kindergarten, a false analogy. The world suffered that morning when the happy name of kindergarten suggested itself to the greatest among educational fathers. No doubt it was simple and fit for its first intention as meaning an out of door garden life for the children, but a false analogy has hampered or killed more than one philosophic system. The children became a plant in a well ordered garden. The analogy appealed to the orderly, scientific German mind, which does not much approve of irregular, spontaneous movement in any sort. Culture, due stimulus, sweetness, and light became the chief features of a great educational code. From the potting shed to the frame, and thence to the flower bed, the little plant gets in due proportion what is good for him. He grows in a seemly way, in ordered ranks, and in fit season puts forth his flower. Now to figure a person by any analogy whatsoever is dangerous and misleading. There is nothing in nature commensurable with a person. Because the analogy of the garden plant is very attractive, it is the more misleading. Manifestations of purpose in a plant are wonderful and delightful, but in a person such manifestations are simply normal. The outcome of any thought is necessarily moulded by that thought, and to have a cultivated garden as the ground plan of our educational thought either means nothing at all, which it would be wronging the master to suppose, or it means undue interference with the spontaneous development of a human being. Mother games too strenuous for a child. To begin with the mother games, a sweet conception, most lovingly worked out. But let us consider. The infant is exquisitely aware of every mood of his mother. The little face clouds with grief or beams with joy in response to the expression of hers. The two left to themselves have rare games. He jumps and pulls, crows and chuckles, crawls and kicks and gurgles with joy, and amid all the play is taught what he may not do. Hands and feet, legs and arms, fingers and toes are continually going while he is awake. Mouth, eyes, and ears are agog. All is play without intention, and mother plays with baby as glad as he. Nature sits quietly by and sees to it that all the play is really work, and development of every sort is going on at a greater rate during the first 2 years of life than at any like period of after life. Enough development and not too much, for baby is an inordinate sleeper. Then comes in the educator and offers a little more. The new games are so pretty and taking that baby might as well be doing these as his own meaningless and clumsy jumpings and pattings. But a real labour is being put upon the child in addition to the heaviest 2 years' work that his life will know. His sympathy with his mother is so acute that he perceives something strenuous in this new play, notwithstanding all the smiles and pretty talk. He answers by endeavour, great in proportion as he is small. His nerve centres and brain power have been unduly taxed. Some of the joy of living has been taken from him. And though his baby response to direct education is very charming, he has less latent power left for the future calls of life. The society of his equals too stimulating for a child. Let us follow the little person to the kindergarten, where he has the stimulus of classmates of his own age. It certainly is stimulating. For ourselves, no society is so much so as that of a number of persons of our own age and standing. This is the great joy of college life, a wholesome joy for all young people for a limited time. But persons of 20 have, or should have, some command over their inhibitory centres. They should not permit the dissipation of nerve power caused by too much social stimulus. Yet even persons of 20 are not always equal to that task of self management in exciting circumstances. What then is to be expected of persons of 2, 3, 4, 5? That the little person looks rather stolid than otherwise is no guarantee against excitement within. The clash and sparkle of our equals now and then stirs us up to health, but for everyday life, the mixed society of elders, juniors, and equals, which we get in a family, gives at the same time the most repose and the most room for individual development. We have all wondered at the good sense, reasonableness, fun, and resourcefulness shown by a child in his own home as compared with the same child in school life. Danger of supplanting nature. Danger lurks in the kindergarten just in proportion to the completeness and beauty of its organisation. It is possible to supplement nature so skilfully that we run some risk of supplanting her, depriving her of space and time to do her own work in her own way. Go and see what Tommy is doing and tell him he mustn't, is not sound doctrine. Tommy should be free to do what he likes with his limbs and his mind through all the hours of the day when he is not sitting up nicely at meals. He should run and jump, leap and tumble, lie on his face watching a worm, or on his back watching the bees in a lime tree. Nature will look after him, and give him promptings of desire to know many things, and somebody must tell as he wants to know, and to do many things, and somebody should be handy just to put him in the way, and to be many things, naughty and good, and somebody should give direction. Importance of personal initiative. Importance of personal initiative. Here we come to the real crux of the kindergarten question. The busy mother says she has no leisure to be that somebody, and the child will run wild and get into bad habits. But we must not make a fetish of habit. Education is a life as well as a discipline. Health, strength, and agility, bright eyes and alert movements, come of a free life, out of doors if it may be. And as for habits, there is no habit or power so useful to man or woman as that of personal initiative. The resourcefulness which will enable a family of children to invent their own games and occupations through the length of a summer's day is worth more in after life than a good deal of knowledge about cubes and hexagons, and this comes not of continual intervention on the mother's part, but of much masterly inactivity. Parents and teachers must sow opportunities. The educational error of our day is that we believe too much in mediators. Now nature is her own mediator, undertakes herself to find work for eyes and ears, taste and touch. She will prick the brain with problems and the heart with feelings. And the part of mother or teacher in the early years, indeed all through life, is to sow opportunities, and then to keep in the background, ready with a guiding or restraining hand only when these are badly wanted. Mothers shirk their work and put it, as they would say, into better hands than their own, because they do not recognise that wise letting alone is the chief thing asked of them, seeing that every mother has in nature an all sufficient handmaid, who arranges for due work and due rest of mind, muscles, and senses. In one way the children of the poor have better chances than those of the rich, Poor children get education out of household ways, but there is a great deal of good teaching to be got out of a wisely ordered nursery, and their own small persons and possessions should, as I have said, afford much kindergarten training to the little family at home. At 6 or 7, definite lessons should begin, and these need not be watered down or served with jam for the acute intelligences that will in this way be brought to bear on them. Only children. But what of only children, or the child too old to play with her baby brother? Surely the kindergarten is a great boon for these. Perhaps so, but a cottage child as a companion, or a lively young nursemaid might be better. A child will have taught himself to paint, paste, cut paper, knit, weave, hammer and saw, make lovely things in clay and sand, build castles with his bricks. Possibly, too, will he have taught himself to read, write, and do sums, besides acquiring no end of knowledge and notions about the world he lives in, by the time he is 6 or 7. What I contend for is that he shall do these things because he chooses, provided that the standard of perfection in his small works be kept before him. The child should be allowed some ordering of his life. The details of family living will give him the repose of an ordered life, but, for the rest, he should have more free growing time than is possible in the most charming school. The fact that lessons look like play is no recommendation. They just want the freedom of play, and the sense of his own ordering that belongs to play. Most of us have little enough opportunity for the ordering of our own lives, so it is well to make much of the years that can be given to children to gain this joyous experience. Helen Keller. I think what I have said of natural development, as opposed to any too carefully organised system, is supported by a recent contribution of unique value to the science of education. I mean the autobiography of Helen Keller. When she was 19 months old, Helen had a severe illness in which she lost sight and hearing, and consequently speech. She never recovered the lost senses, and here, we should say, was a soul almost inviolably sealed, to which there was no approach but through the single sense of touch. Yet this lady's book, written with her own unaided hands (she used a typewriter), with hardly any revision, should rank as a classic for the purity and pregnancy of the style, independently of the vital interest of the matter. How was the miracle accomplished? Of her childhood Helen says herself that, save for a few impressions, the shadow of the prison house enveloped it. But there were always roses, and she had the sense of smell. And there was love, but she was not loving then. When she was 7, Miss Sullivan came to her. This lady had herself been blind for some years, and had been at the Perkins Institute, founded by that Dr. Howe who liberated the intelligence of Laura Bridgman. But Miss Sullivan is no mere output of any institution. She is a person of fine sanity and wholesomeness, trusting to her personal initiative, and aware from the first that her work was to liberate the personality of her little pupil, and by no means to superimpose her own. Thus I came up out of Egypt, says Miss Keller, on the arrival of her teacher, and the voice which she heard from Sinai said, "Knowledge is love and light and vision." And then follows that amazing and enthralling epic which tells how it was all done, how one word, water, was the key which opened the doors of the child's mind, while the word love opened those of the closed heart. Thenceforth many new words came every day, with crowds of ideas, and it is not too much to say that this imprisoned and desolate child entered upon such a large inheritance of thought and knowledge, of gladness and vision, as few of us of the seeing and hearing world attain to. The instrument in this great liberation was nothing more than the familiar manual alphabet, followed in course of time by raised books and braille. Miss Sullivan on Systems of Education. Like all great discoveries, this, of a soul, was in all its steps marked by simplicity. Miss Sullivan had little love for psychologists and all their ways, would have no experiments, would not have her pupil treated as a phenomenon but as a person. No, she says, I don't want any more kindergarten materials. I am beginning to suspect all elaborate and special systems of education. They seem to me to be built up on the supposition that every child is a kind of idiot who must be taught to think, whereas if the child is left to himself, he will think more and better, if less slowly. Let him go and come freely. Let him touch real things, and combine his impressions for himself, instead of sitting indoors at a little round table, while a sweet voiced teacher suggests that he build a stone wall with his wooden blocks, or make a rainbow out of strips of coloured paper, or plant straw trees in bead flower pots. Such teaching fills the mind with artificial associations that must be got rid of before the child can develop independent ideas out of actual experiences. It is a great thing to have a study of education, as it were de novo, in which we see the triumph of mind, not only over apparently insuperable natural obstacles, but over the dead wall of systematized education, a more complete hindrance to many a poor child than her grievous defects proved to Helen Keller. The Kindergarten in the United States. This question of the kindergarten as the proper place for the education of young children is so important that I should like to recommend to parents and teachers the examination of the subject contained in the Special Reports published by the Board of Education. We must go to the United States to witness the apotheosis of educational theory. I say theory rather than practice, because the American mind, like the French, seems to me severely logical, as well as generously impulsive. A theory arrives, is liberally entertained, and is set to work with due appliances on a magnificent scale to do that which in it lies for the education of a great people. That is to say, educational science in America appears to be deductive rather than inductive. Theories are translated into experiments with truly imposing zeal and generosity. An inductive theory of education is, on the other hand, arrived at by means of long, slow, various, and laborious experiments which disclose here a little and there a little of universal truth. The Americans have chosen, perhaps, the easier way, and in the end they too experiment upon their theory. The kindergarten system illustrates what I mean. Notwithstanding its German name, the kindergarten is not a common product of the fatherland. It is in America that the ideas of Froebel have received their greatest development, that the kindergarten has become a cult, and that the great teacher a prophet. But the impulse has worn itself out. Anyway, it is waxing weak. Mr. Thistleton Mark on the Kindergarten. According to Mr. Thistleton Mark, whose able paper on Moral Education in American Schools offers matter for much profitable reflection, even a stationary Froebelian is driven to have some better holdfast than the ipse dixit of the great reformer. The word kindergarten is no longer a proper noun, signifying always and everywhere the one, sole, original, and identical thing. It is a common noun, and as such is assured of a more permanent place in American speech. That is to say, educational thought in America is tending towards the broad and natural conception expressed in the phrase, education is a life. But I wish that educationalists would give up the name kindergarten. I cannot help thinking that it is somewhat of a strain to conscious minds to draw the cover of Froebelian doctrine and practice over the broader and more living conceptions that are abroad to day. Even revolutionized kindergarten practice must suffer from the memory and habit of weaknesses such as are pointed out by Dr. Stanley Hall in the following words. Dr. Stanley Hall on the kindergarten. The most decadent intellectual new departure of the American Froebelists is the emphasis now laid upon the mother plays as the acme of kindergarten wisdom. These are represented by very crude poems, indifferent music, and pictures illustrating certain incidents of child life believed to be of fundamental and typical significance. I have read these in German and in English, have strummed the music, and have given a brief course of lectures from the sympathetic standpoint, trying to put all the new wine of meaning I could think of into them. But I am driven to the conclusion that, if they are not positively unwholesome and harmful for the child, and productive of anti scientific and unphilosophical intellectual habits in the teacher, they should nevertheless be superseded by the far better things now available. Another cardinal error of the kindergarten is the intensity of its devotion to gifts and occupations. In devising these, Froebel showed great sagacity, but the scheme as it left his own hands was a very inadequate expression of his educational ideas, even for his time. He thought it a perfect grammar of play and an alphabet of industries, and in this opinion he was utterly mistaken. Play and industry were then relatively undeveloped, and while his devices were beneficent for the peasant children in the country, they lead in the interests of the modern city child a very pallid and unreal life. With these important utterances I must conclude a superficial examination of the very important question, is the kindergarten the best training ground for the child? End of Part 5, Chapter 3.
Part 5, Chapter 4 of Home Education Series, Volume 1, Home Education. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Home Education Series, Volume 1, Home Education by Charlotte Mason. Part 5, Chapter 4. Read by J.L. Baldwin. Reading. Time of teaching to read, an open question. Reading presents itself first among the lessons to be used as instruments of education, although it is open to discussion whether the child should acquire the art unconsciously, from his infancy upwards, or whether the effort should be deferred until he is, say, 6 or 7, and then made with vigor. In a valuable letter addressed to her son John, we have the way of teaching to read adopted by that pattern mother, the mother of the Wesleys. Mrs. Wesley's Plan. None of them was taught to read till 5 years old, except Kezzy, in whose case I was overruled, and she was more years in learning than any of the rest had been months. The way of teaching was this. The day before a child began to learn, the house was set in order, everyone's work appointed them, and a charge given that no one should come into the room from 9 to 12, or from 2 to 5, which were our school hours. One day was allowed the child wherein to learn its letters, and each of them did in that time know all its letters, great and small, except Molly and Nancy, who were a day and a half before they knew them perfectly, for which I thought them then very dull, but the reason why I thought them so was because the rest learned them so readily, and your brother Samuel, who was the first child I ever taught, learned the alphabet in a few hours. He was 5 years old the 10th of February. The next day he began to learn, and as soon as he knew the letters, began at the first chapter of Genesis. He was taught to spell the first verse, then to read it over and over until he could read it offhand without hesitation, so on to the second verse, etc., till he took 10 verses for a lesson, which he quickly did. Easter fell low that year, and by Whitsuntide he could read a chapter very well, for he read continually and had such a prodigious memory that I cannot remember to have told him the same word twice. What was yet stranger, any word he had learnt in his lesson he knew wherever he saw it, either in his Bible or any other book, by which means he learned very soon to read an English author well. It is much to be wished that thoughtful mothers would more often keep account of the methods they employ with their children, with some definite note of the success of this or that plan. Many persons consider that to learn to read a language so full of anomalies and difficulties as our own is a task which should not be imposed too soon on the childish mind. But, as a matter of fact, few of us can recollect how or when we learned to read. For all we know, it came by nature, like the art of running. And not only so, but often mothers of the educated classes do not know how their children learned to read. "Oh, he taught himself," is all the account his mother can give of little Dick's proficiency. Whereby it is plain that this notion of the extreme difficulty of learning to read is begotten by the elders rather than by the children. There would be no little books entitled Reading Without Tears, if tears were not sometimes shed over the reading lesson. But, really, when that is the case, the fault rests with the teacher. The alphabet. As for his letters, the child usually teaches himself. He has his box of ivory letters and picks out P for pudding, B for blackbird, H for horse, big and little, and knows them both. But the learning of the alphabet should be made a means of cultivating the child's observation. He should be made to see what he looks at. Make a big B in the air, and let him name it. Then let him make round O and crooked S and T for Tommy, and you name the letters as the little finger forms them with unsteady strokes in the air. To make the small letters thus from memory is a work of more art, and requires more careful observation on the child's part. A tray of sand is useful at this stage. The child draws his finger boldly through the sand, and then puts a back to his D, and behold his first essay in making a straight line and a curve. But the devices for making the learning of the ABC interesting are endless. There is no occasion to hurry the child. Let him learn one form at a time, and know it so well that he can pick out the D's, say big and little, in a page of large print. Let him say D for duck, dog, doll, thus: d-uck, d-og, prolonging the sound of the initial consonant, and at last sounding d alone, not d but d, the mere sound of the consonant separated as far as possible from the following vowel. Let the child alone, and he will learn the alphabet for himself, but few mothers can resist the pleasure of teaching it, and there is no reason why they should, for this kind of learning is no more than play to the child, and if the alphabet be taught to the little student, his appreciation of both form and sound will be cultivated. When should he begin? Whenever his box of letters begins to interest him. The baby of 2 will often be able to name half a dozen letters, and there is nothing against it so long as the finding and naming of letters is a game to him. But he must not be urged, required to show off, teased to find letters, when his heart is set on other play. Word making. The first exercises in the making of words will be just as pleasant to the child. Exercises treated as a game, which yet teach the powers of the letters, will be better to begin with than actual sentences. Take up 2 of his letters and make the syllable at. Tell him it is the word we use when we say at home, at school. Then put B to at, bat, C to at, cat, fat, hat, mat, sat, rat, and so on. First, let the child say what the word becomes with each initial consonant. Then let him add the right consonant to at in order to make hat, pat, cat. Let the syllables all be actual words which he knows. Set the words in a row and let him read them off. Do this with the short vowel sounds in combination with each of the consonants, and the child will learn to read off dozens of words of 3 letters, and will master the short vowel sounds with initial and final consonants without effort. Before long he will do the lesson for himself. How many words can you make with N and another letter, with odd and another letter, etc.? Do not hurry him. Word making with long vowels, etc. When this sort of exercise becomes so easy that it is no longer interesting, let the long sounds of the vowels be learnt in the same way. Use the same syllables as before with a final E. Thus, at becomes 8, and we get late, pate, rate, etc. The child may be told that A in rate is long A, in rat is short A. He will make the new sets of words with much facility, helped by the experience he gained in the former lessons. Then the same sort of thing with final ing, ang, ong, ung, as ring, fang, long, sung. Initial the as then, that, final th as with pith, hath, lath, and so on, through endless combinations which will suggest themselves. This is not reading, but it is preparing the ground for reading. Words will be no longer unfamiliar, perplexing objects when the child meets with them in a line of print. Require him to pronounce the words he makes with such finish and distinctness that he can himself hear and count the sounds in a given word. Early spelling. Accustom him from the first to shut his eyes and spell the word he has made. This is important. Reading is not spelling, nor is it necessary to spell in order to read well, but the good speller is the child whose eye is quick enough to take in the letters which compose it, in the act of reading off a word. And this is a habit to be acquired from the first. Accustom him to see the letters in the word, and he will do so without effort. If words were always made on a given pattern in English, if the same letters always represented the same sounds, learning to read would be an easy matter, for the child would soon acquire the few elements of which all words would, in that case, be composed. But many of our English words are each a law unto itself. There is nothing for it but the child must learn to know them at sight. He must recognize which precisely as he recognizes be, because he has seen it before, been made to look at it with interest, so that the pattern of the word is stamped on his retentive brain. This process should go on side by side with the other, the learning of the powers of the letters. For the more variety you can throw into his reading lessons, the more will the child enjoy them. Lessons in word making help him to take intelligent interest in words, but his progress in the art of reading depends chiefly on the reading at sight lessons. Reading at sight. The teacher must be content to proceed very slowly, securing the ground under her feet as she goes. Say, "Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are," is the first lesson, just those 2 lines. Read the passage for the child very slowly, sweetly, with just expression, so that it is pleasant to him to listen. Point to each word as you read. Then point to twinkle, wonder, star, what, and expect the child to pronounce each word in the verse taken promiscuously. Then, when he shows that he knows each word by itself, and not before, let him read the 2 lines with clear enunciation and expression. Insist from the first on clear, beautiful reading, and do not let the child fall into a dreary monotone, no more pleasant to himself than to his listener. Of course, by this time he is able to say the 2 lines, and let him say them clearly and beautifully. In his after lessons he will learn the rest of the little poem. The reading of prose. At this stage his reading lessons must advance so slowly that he may just as well learn his reading exercises, both prose and poetry, as recitation lessons. Little poems suitable to be learned in this way will suggest themselves at once. But perhaps prose is better on the whole as offering more of the words in everyday use, of Saxon origin, and of anomalous spelling. Short fables and such graceful simple prose as we have in Mrs. Gatty's Parables from Nature, and still better in Mrs. Barbauld's prose poems, are very suitable. Even for their earliest reading lessons it is unnecessary to put twaddle into the hands of children. But we have not yet finished the reading lesson on Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. The child should hunt through 2 or 3 pages of good clear type for little, star, you, are, each of the words he has learned, until the word he knows looks out upon him like the face of a friend in the crowd of strangers, and he is able to pounce upon it anywhere. Lest he grow weary of the search, the teacher should guide him unawares to the line or paragraph where the word he wants occurs. Already the child has accumulated a little capital. He knows 8 or 10 words so well that he will recognize them anywhere, and the lesson has occupied probably 10 minutes. The next reading at sight lesson will begin with a hunt for the familiar words, and then "Up above the world so high, like a diamond in the sky," should be gone through in the same way. As spelling is simply the art of seeing the letters in a word as we see the features of a face, say to the child, "Can you spell sky?" or any of the shorter words. He is put on his mettle, and if he fail this time, be sure he will be able to spell the word when you ask him next. But do not let him learn to spell or even say the letters aloud with the word before him. As for understanding what they read, the children will be full of bright, intelligent remarks and questions, and will take this part of the lesson into their own hands. Indeed, the teacher will have to be on her guard not to let them carry her away from the subject. Careful pronunciation. The little people will probably have to be pulled up on the score of pronunciation. They must render high, sky, like, world with delicate precision. Diamond they will no doubt wish to hurry over and say as diamond, just as they will reduce history to history. But here is another advantage of slow and steady progress: the saying of each word receives due attention, and the child is trained in the habit of careful enunciation. Every day increases the number of words he is able to read at sight, and the more words he knows already, the longer his reading lesson becomes, in order to afford the 10 or a dozen new words which he should master every day. A year's work. But what a snail's progress, you are inclined to say! Not so slow after all. A child will thus learn, without appreciable labor, from 2,000 to 3,000 words in the course of a year. In other words, he will learn to read, for the mastery of this number of words will carry him with comfort through most of the books that fall in his way. Ordinary method. Now compare the steady progress and constant interest and liveliness of such lessons with the deadly weariness of the ordinary reading lesson. The child blunders through a page or two in a dreary monotone without expression, with imperfect enunciation. He comes to a word he does not know, and he spells it. That throws no light on the subject, and he is told the word. He repeats it, but as he has made no mental effort to secure the word, the next time he meets with it the same process is gone through. The reading lesson for that day comes to an end. The pupil has been miserably bored, and has not acquired one new word. Eventually he learns to read, somehow, by mere dint of repetition, but consider what an abuse of his intelligence is a system of teaching which makes him undergo daily labor with little or no result, and gives him a distaste for books before he has learned to use them. End of Part 5, Chapter 4.
Part 5, Chapter 5 of Home Education Series, Volume 1, Home Education. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Home Education Series, Volume 1, Home Education by Charlotte Mason. Part 5, Chapter 5, The First Reading Lesson. Read by Amy Bodkin, Navarre, Florida. You don't mean to say you would go plump into words of 3 or 4 syllables before a child knows his letters? It is possible to read words without knowing the alphabet, as you may know a face without singling out its features. But we learn not only the names, but the sounds of the letters before we begin to read words. Our children learn their letters without any teaching. We always keep by us a shallow table drawer, the bottom covered half an inch deep with sand. Before they are 2, the babies make round O and crooked S and T for Tommy, and so on, with dumpy, uncertain little fingers. The elder children teach the little ones by way of a game. The sand is capital. We have various devices, but none so good as that. Children love to be doing. The funny shaky lines the little finger makes in the sand will be 10 times as interesting as the shapes the eye sees. But the reading, I can't get over 3 syllables for the first lesson. Why, it's like teaching a 12-month-old child to waltz. You say that because we forget that a group of letters is no more than the sign of a word, while a word is only the vocal sign of a thing or an act. This is how the child learns. First he gets the notion of table. He sees several tables. He finds they have legs by which you can scramble up, very often covers which you may pull off, and on them many things lie, good and pleasant for a baby to enjoy. Sometimes, too, you can pull these things off the table, and they go down with a bang, which is nice. The grown-up people call this pleasant thing, full of many interests, table, and by baby says table too, and the word table comes to mean, in a vague way, all this to him. A round table, on the table, and so on form part of the idea of table to him. In the same way, baby chimes in when his mother sings. She says, "Baby, sing," and by notions of sing, kiss, love, dawn on his brain. Yes, the darlings, and it's surprising how many words a child knows even before he can speak them. Pussy, dolly, carriage soon convey interesting ideas to him. That's just it. Interest the child in the thing, and he soon learns the sound sign for it. That is, its name. Now, I maintain that when he is a little older, he should learn the form sign, that is, the printed word on the same principle. It is far easier for a child to read plum pudding than to read two, because plum pudding conveys a far more interesting idea. That may be when he gets into words of 3 or 4 syllables, but what would you do while he's in words of 1 syllable, indeed of 2 or 3 letters? I should never put him into words of 1 syllable at all. The bigger the word, the more striking the look of it, and therefore the easier it is to read, provided always that the idea it conveys is interesting to a child. It is sad to see an intelligent child toiling over a reading lesson infinitely below his capacity. Ath, eth, ith, oth, uth. Or, at the very best, the cat sat on the mat. How should we like to begin to read German, for example, by toiling over all conceivable combinations of letters arranged on no principle but similarity of sound? Or worse still, that our reading should be graduated according to the number of letters each word contains. We should be lost in a hopeless fog before a page of words of 3 letters, all drearily like one another, with no distinctive features for the eye to seize upon. But the child? Oh, well, children are different. No doubt it is good for the child to grind in this mill. But this is only one of many ways in which children are needlessly and cruelly oppressed. You are taking high moral ground. All the same, I don't think I am convinced it is far easier for a child to spell cat, cat, than to spell plum pudding, plum pudding. But spelling and reading are 2 things. You must learn to spell in order to write words, not to read them. The child is droning over a reading lesson, spells C-O-U-G-H. You say cough, and she repeats. By dint of repetition, she learns at last to associate the look of the word with the sound, and says cough without spelling it. And you think she has arrived at cough through C-O-U-G-H. Not a bit of it. C-O-F spells cough. Yes, but cough has a silent U and a G-H with the sound of F. There, I grant, is a great difficulty. If only there were no silent letters, and if all letters had always the same sound, we should indeed have reading made easy. The phonetic people have something to say for themselves. You would agree with the writer of an article in a number of leading review. Plow ought to be written and printed P-L-O-W, through T-H-R-U, enough, E-N-U-F, ought, A-U-T, or O-R-T, and so on. All this goes on the mistaken idea that in reading we look at the letters which compose a word, think of their sounds, combine these, and form the word. We do nothing of the kind. We accept a word written or printed simply as the symbol of a word we are accustomed to say. If the word is new to us, we may try to make something of the letters, but we know so well that this is a shot in the dark that we are careful not to say the new word until we have heard someone else say it. Yes, but children are different. Children are the same, only more so. We could, if we liked, break up a word into its sounds, or put certain sounds together to make a word, but these are efforts of mind beyond the range of children. First, at last, they learn to know a word by the look of it, and the more striking it looks, the easier it is to recognize, provided always that the printed word is one which they already know very well by sound and by sense. It is not clear yet. Suppose you tell me step by step how you would give your first reading lesson. An illustration helps one so much. Very well. Bobby had his first lesson yesterday on his 6th birthday. The lesson was part of the celebration. By the way, I think it's rather a good plan to begin a new study with a child on his birthday or some great day. He begins by thinking the new study a privilege. That is a hint, but go on. Did Bobby know his letters? Yes, he had picked them up, as you say, but I had been careful not to allow any small readings. You know how Susanna Wesley used to retire to her room with the child who was to have his first reading lesson and not to appear again for some hours when the boy came out able to read a good part of the first chapter of Genesis? Well, Bobby's first reading lesson was a solemn occasion, too, for which we had been preparing for a week or two. First, I bought a dozen penny copies of the History of Cock Robin. Good bold type, bad pictures that we cut out. Then we had a nursery pasting day, pasting the sheets on common drawing paper, 6 one side down and 6 the other, so that now we had 6 complete copies and not 12. Then we cut up the first page only of all 6 copies, line by line and word by word. We gathered up the words and put them in a box, and our preparations were complete. Now for the lesson. Bobby and I are shut in by ourselves in the morning room. I always use a blackboard in teaching the children. I write up in good clear print hand, Cock Robin. Bobby watches with the more interest because he knows his letters. I say, pointing to the word Cock Robin, which he repeats. Then the words in the box are scattered on the table, and he finds half a dozen Cock Robins with great ease. We do the same thing with sparrow, arrow, said, killed, who, and so on till all the words in the verse have been learned. The words on the blackboard grow into a column which Bob reads backwards and forwards and every way except as the words run in the verse. Then Bobby arranges the loose words into columns like that on the board. Then into columns of his own devising which he reads off. Lastly, culminating joy, the whole lesson has been a delight. He finds among the loose words at my dictation, Who killed Cock Robin? I said the sparrow. With my bow and arrow, I killed Cock Robin. Arranging the words in verse form. Then I had still one unmutilated copy, out of which Bob had the pleasure of reading the verse, and he read it forwards and backwards. So long as he lives he will know those 12 words. No doubt it was a pleasant lesson, but think of all the pasting and cutting. Yes, that is troublesome. I wish some publisher would provide us with what we want. Nursery rhymes in good bold type, with boxes of loose words to match, a separate box or division for each page so that the child may not be confused by having too many words to hunt amongst. The point is that he should see and look at the new word many times so that its shape becomes impressed on his brain. I see, but he is only able to read Cock Robin. He has no general power of reading. On the contrary, he will read those 12 words wherever he meets with them. Suppose he learns 10 words a day. In half a year he will have at least 600 words. He will know how to read a little. Excellent, supposing your children remember all they learn. At the end of a week mine would remember Cock Robin perhaps, but the rest would be gone. Oh, but we keep what we get. When we have mastered the words of the second verse, Bob runs through the first in the book, naming words here and there as I point to them. It takes less than a minute, and the ground is secured. The first lesson must have been long? I'm sorry to say it lasted half an hour. The child's interest tempted me to do more than I should. It all sounds very attractive. A sort of game, but I cannot be satisfied that a child should learn to read without knowing the powers of the letters. You constantly see a child spell a word over to himself and then pronounce it, the more so if he has been carefully taught the sounds of the letters, not merely their names. Naturally, for though many of our English words are each a law unto itself, others offer a key to a whole group, as arrow gives us sparrow, marrow, harrow. But we have alternate days. one for reading, the other for word building, and that is one way to secure variety and sow the joyous interest which is the real secret of success. End of Part 5, Chapter 5.